Hi, my name is Stephanie Logan. I am an associate professor and department chair at Springfield College.
Excellent. And we're going to be talking today about your article from 2018, A Historical and Political Look at Modern School Choice Movement. And could you kind of give us an overview of what the article does and why you wrote it?
Well, the piece is actually a result or an offshoot of my dissertation. For my dissertation, I looked at what were the impacts of charter schools on the budget, operations, and educational services of Columbus City Schools. So this particular piece, like I said, actually comes from that literature review, which actually was my favorite part of the dissertation process. And a part, reading the literature, examining the literature is something that I have continued to enjoy, as I've continued to write and research. And so I took, like I said, a segment of the literature review from my dissertation and expanded it to really just situate this concept of school choice and where it originated from and what it looks like, in present day.
Well, I think that leads us directly into what is school choice and where did it originate?
School choice has actually always existed in what we know as the United States, but even the colonial times. So school choice has existed for some, but not for all. So folks who could afford to send their children to school, primarily men, boys, were afforded the opportunity to go to school. So, and they had choice, in regards, the choice as far as if we think statistically, as far as numbers, was certainly not expansive. There were the opportunities existed for boys of the colonial elite. So we know that we are talking about boys of European ancestry, had that choice, and that was what families could do early on. So as the opportunity for education expanded, others became able to exercise choice as far as engaging with education or not. Eventually we know education became something that was mandated, required, law enforced. So that provided opportunities. Those opportunities, primarily existed around what was offered by the state, that public, what we know as public education, and then that parochial or those religious institutions. So those were often the options that families had, or not engaging in what is considered structured or organized education, but engaging in something more community-based, more family-based. So those choices have been around for a long time. And in many ways, those are our choices today. Few additions, but those are our hardcore choices today.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think the article does really well, is kind of lays out how this evolved, but the choices have just kind of continued along. And I think, we know about board versus Board of Education changing the landscape of education in the 1954. But can you speak a little bit about, like, I know you mentioned Milton Friedman and some of the other ideas that were kicking around right around the time Brown happened, and what happened after.
Okay, so I will have to offer that my positioning and even my own understanding has grown since I've originally engaged in this work. And so, in even considering Milton Friedman, because I believe I frame things as sort of this conservative and liberal, so kind of put it on this binary. And, at the time I did not necessarily call out what probably needs to be called out, that some of that conservative perspective was not wanting to have their children sit next to Black children. Lending to what are some other ways in which it is that children, specifically white children, can access education. But there has always been a desire to sort of apply business or market principles to education. Like that's existed for a while. And that's sort of where Milton Friedman and Friedman-like folks come in, believing that education is, we should view it as part of the capitalist structure. And so if this particular form of education is not do well, then there's something else in the market needs to exist that will then fuel it to do well, or it will be dismissed from the market because there will be no demand for it. So, yes.
Well, that's a good explanation of his point of view. But I was also struck by what happened in the 60s with and I understand that you've kind of evolved your thinking, but the liberal side of things with these, I forget, the freedom schools, I think they were called, and maybe you could kind of tell us what that was about.
Well, freedom schools were part of actually a multiracial, specifically Black and white effort. It was known that schools in the South, particularly Mississippi, because that's sort of where they originated, were not doing right by children. This separate and equal, like there was nothing, there were things that they were separate, but there was nothing about them that were equal. So it was this sense of grassroots community organization to teach children. It was part of the overall theme of the time: voter registration, engaging with the political process. So education was a part of that, over the overall objective, specifically relative to Freedom Summer. So you had folks from the North who came down to the South and helped engage in this work alongside with folks who were a part of the community, but to support the children, because they were, sort of the next generation, and children were very involved in the civil rights movement in many ways, shape, or form. So it was also a ground, kind of a breeding ground or a place to begin to instill and harness the next set of activists, civil rights activists.
Yeah, and I was struck by that too, where it's kind of like building the next, kind of like, if we can't get the schools to do it, then the civil rights movement will just create these schools. And then that kind of led to some of the first charter schools. Is that?
Yes, there's thought that that the Freedom School model, which didn't disappear, that there were elements that remained in the South, but certainly made their way to the North, that resembled what we sort of know as charter schools today. So yes.
Well, and then we move into the post civil rights era, the 1970s, when I was in school. And I remember I came in right as the schools were dividing into magnets. And there was in Cleveland Heights, we had the open school format, and they were doing all these experimentation. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened in the 70s, and again, why it kind of.
Well, certainly the 70s was an opportunity for experimentation, and that is really when desegregation plans rose and then fall. So we saw the rise and fall of those, and the magnet schools in particular were ways in which school districts were attempting to fight off white flight. So if we provide these special schools that give students these opportunities and sort of create segregation within an integrated school district, that white families would stay in the public school district. Now, magnet schools some of them have persevered. For example, I think of Baltimore City. I did work for Baltimore City Public Schools, and the most prominent schools in the district, came about during this period, and they still exist. Did they assist in delaying white flight? No, but they still exist and they are still the prominent schools in the district. And a lot of folks on Baltimore City Council, prominent folks in Baltimore City, probably went to one, of those particular schools.
Yeah, and I think Cleveland Public at the moment has a modified magnet where like John Hay is the college prep, and then you have some of the other schools that are, more, what's the word? Vocational.
Yes.
Yeah, that's academic. And I guess this wasn't, as you say, a white flight, but it was also when people started talking about parental choice.
Mhm.
And I've always read that as kind of a code word, but I guess it may not necessarily always be that. Could you kind of?
Yeah, sometimes it can be a code word for white families not wanting to be to have their children in schools with students, around this time, primarily in the 70s, it was still on this black-white continuum in certain regions of the country. And certainly there were efforts to not integrate, with Mexican American children as Asian immigration started to rise, because and this is when a lot of immigrants, specifically immigrants of color, could really come into the country after the Immigration Act that also happened in the 60s. So as you are having an influx of folks, but thinking of the communities that are already here, we are sort of looking at this black-white continuum. The code was for, yes, we do not want white families not wanting their children in schools with Black students, but I will say that Black families have considered choice, but it may not have looked, it may have looked different. For them, it looks as, how do we supplement education? The church being a very important role. How does the church play a role in the overall education of the child? So, it just looked different for the particular community.
Right, and I think we also in the 70s start getting tax credits, deductions, and then the birth of the voucher system, right?
Yes.
And I guess how much of this do you think, and I'm just thinking of this at the top of my head, was tied to Brown and the control of like school funding?
I think the rise of the tax credits, the rise of the vouchers is more in alignment with the not wanting to integrate, because it gave specifically white parents, credit for exercising their choice to put their child or children into private education. So we know that public school funding is based on property taxes. So you are paying into a system that your child may not be benefiting from. So here it is how we can remedy that, and you exercise that choice. And there is also, a notion as religious conservatism begins to rise, and this dissatisfaction with the worldliness of the public school system. So that also plays. So these are perspectives that are bubbling up simultaneously. And they have different goals, but they are happening simultaneously and sort of lends to the same impact, and that is siphoning money that would go to public education away and diverting it to, whether it's the tax credits, vouchers, to private or parochial institutions. That's the result, though the intent for wanting them may have been different.
Well, and that kind of leads us into the Reagan years and the beginning of, and I was surprised to kind of understand from your article, and I think it lays it out really well, is how, this report in 1983, Nation at Risk, leads to kind of this No Child Left Behind, and then there's this continuum, which I think would be really important to hear about.
Certainly. So, with a nation at risk, the nation is at risk. We are no longer at the top. the United States really had a concerted, when Sputnik was launched, the United States had a real concerted effort to really have students focus on math and science, because we have got to get to the moon. And so the United States got to the moon, and it's kind of like, well, what's next? And so, there are some, I kind of see them as deficit views. Well, now that we're educating everybody, that's the reason that we have fallen from being at the top. And then others would say, well, are we truly educating all equally or equitably? Is everyone really truly receiving the best education that allows them to be their best self? So that's sort of the other side. But A Nation at Risk says that, the nation was not doing well. And one of sort of the tangible, I'm going to say the word benefits, but it's not really, folks in education don't see it as a benefit. This notion of accountability. Accountability is not what's the problem. Accountability measures are necessary, but it is the overemphasis of accountability without considering other factors that impact the teaching and learning process. So yes, No Child Left Behind led to programs that, eventually, because under the Clinton, we had Goals 2000, and eventually we get No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top. And for whatever reason, maybe because of a pandemic, education, there's just been no signature notion from a federal administration sort of since Race to the Top.
Yeah, and I think that the competition of the voucher system is really important to kind of unpack, because I think it ties back to Friedman and also ties to Reagan and the Bush administration too, where this competition, where schools would compete for dollars, it's crazy to me, but that's just, maybe you can explain it better to me.
Well, again, that goes from the capitalist model that, sort of how I often like to explain it. How is it that you have a Burger King on one corner, a McDonald's on another corner, a Wendy's on another corner? And I grew up in Cleveland, so it was Rally's, but it's Checkers and other parts of the country. So you can have these 4 burger places on each of these corners. What is necessary to get the customers in? And so it is applying that notion of marketing, advertising, what do you do for quality control relative to your product, applying all of these principles to education. But those consumer perspectives don't work when your product, so to speak, are children. And so that's where this can create some challenges with applying market principles when you are dealing with human beings.
Well, and I also thought it was interesting, because I've never seen it kind of laid out like this before, that when you have the voucher system supposedly introducing this market choice, as you were saying, then most of the vouchers went to low-income people, which then kind of defeated the purpose of the market, right? Do you understand where I'm kind of going with that?
Correct. So, certainly in thinking of the Cleveland Scholarship Fund, for example, a lot of, or that was a way, at least at the surface, to offer families in low income communities to exercise choice, specifically, again, the money going to parochial schools, because those are often, but here's the thing, offering choice to go to your neighborhood parochial school versus using it to a parochial school. Let's say if a person is in Cleveland in Cleveland Heights, a parochial school in Shaker Heights. Like there's still this, we're offering choice, but they still must stay in their neighborhood. So there's access to this opportunity, but there's still certain stipulations, in regards to geography that remain at play. So yes, choice to folks who are considered low income, but there's still limitations to where that choice can be exercised, so to speak.
Well, and it also kind of undermines the Miltonian, idea of free market, because not everyone has equal access to it, so then it can't be beneficial to the wealthy, I guess.
Correct. Because free market would mean every child, every family would have access to it. And that particular scholarship fund certainly was to a targeted population. But yeah, in the free market, we all have access. But then I would question, do we all really have access even in the free market? So, how that scholarship opportunity and even the one in Milwaukee, how those things played out certainly raised some questions, and why these sort of free market ideas, when we're dealing with human beings, are a little bit more complicated.
Right, because the product of the schools is humans. It's not, it's an educated human who can maybe take a test, or a test score could be quantified, but at the end of the day, like you're talking about, as you said earlier, children.
Correct. And there are more, there's, when we think of the teaching and learning process, there's so much more to that experience than what's just happening in the school. And the free market doesn't take that into consideration.
I kind of wanted to circle back to when you were talking about the residential, we're kind of trapped within our neighborhoods. And I think that, or certain populations are trapped, I should say. But, you make a very strong point at the end of the article about this residential model being really detrimental. And that was surprising to me. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. So going back to choice has always existed for those who could make the choice. And even thinking about the creation of magnet schools to fight off white flight, the ultimate choice any family can make is where they choose to live. And that impacts the education. And many families make choices about education or where to live based on what are the schools, specifically if they have school-age children. What are the schools? And while that is absolutely important and admirable, and as families should consider that, there are some sort of implicit things that are not at the conscious level that come with that. And so the whiter the school, the better the school. And even for families of color, that sense of we are socialized into this thinking about this access to whiteness means that things are better. So those are things lots of families, almost all families, who are able to pick up and to move, consider in that process. And so, sort of that barrier to true integration has to do with the barrier to community and neighborhood integration. We live in pretty much school districts where you go to your neighborhood school, especially at the elementary level. And that is understandable. Who wants, to send a 5-year-old way across town? But again, if we really consider, especially present day, our schools are more segregated than they were, pre-Brown versus Board of Education. And that is because cities are so segregated. And even as some neighborhoods are experiencing gentrification, those folks may not have school-age children, or they are in a position they can make the choice to send their children to private schools or parochial schools or some other religious type of school. So if we're going to have a conversation about school choice in the modern times, i.e. the 2020s, we have to simultaneously talk about residential segregation and how that has played, but continues to play a role into who it is that young children and older children are sitting next to in the classroom.
Well, that's very interesting. And there's a line in your paper about racially and economically integrated neighborhoods do not necessarily guarantee integrated schools. And that's Cleveland Heights. I mean, we have in the last so many years, the white flight from the high school, the grade school is usually pretty evenly distributed. But when you get to the high school, over 80% of the white families take their children out.
Mhm.
And that just, that really drove that point home for me.
Yes.
And, we had a really bitter school funding debate over the pandemic about vouchers and teacher pay and this kind of stuff. And I, the race component of it was never broached. And that was just really interesting to me because
like most folks and especially white folks, and it is understandable on one hand, but it's necessary to have the conversation on the other hand. It's uncomfortable to talk about race. And there are some fears that many white folks have, because who wants to be called a racist? Like, that being the ultimate one. But race, as well as class, as well as gender, all three of those together and separately have played a role in how our nation was shaped. And therefore, it is something that is at the table when we have these difficult or critical conversations around school funding, around choice. And to ignore them does a disservice to having a thorough conversation to make a well-rounded decision. And in present time, we are living with the consequences of policies and practices that were set up before us, and to not call them out only allows those policies and practices that for some of us we had nothing to do with, but not calling them out allows them to continue. So yes, avoiding the conversation and talking about funding, teacher pay, all of these other bits that are a part of the conversation, not talking about race, we don't solve the problem completely.
that's correct. And I think one of the things that's brought up a lot too is that a lot of African-American families use the vouchers to escape the school district as well.
Mhm.
And that's, but as you say, that has to do with class and gender and some other things as well. So it's a complicated picture overall.
It is. For, and again, I go back to this notion of, and I have had friends and I have had colleagues who identify as Black or African American, and listening to them wrestle with the school choice options for them depending on their own economic positioning. It is this socialization around access to whiteness lends to better schooling. So it is not surprising to see Black families using vouchers to have their children access better education, because that's what all families want. All families want their children to be successful and have the best opportunities. So that is a normal, natural there. So there's nothing wrong with that desire. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And that is very true. And we do have to have a conversation about why folks are leaving. What is happening in the public schools? What do we do for that equality? Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings is I admire her as a scholar. And one of the pieces that she has written is, can we at least have Plessy? Because it doesn't seem like we have the promises of Boer. Can we at least have Plessy, which is separate and equal? Because things are separate. I mean, you can look at statistics as far as where children of color are in schools and where white children are, and how some white children, even though they are statistically now the minority as far as numbers in public schools, they can have very insular school experiences. But can we at least have Plessy? Can we at least have the equal? And that's that conversation that, for families who are making the choice to use the voucher, specifically Black families, they know that it's not equal. And therefore, they're looking for that. So it's complicated.
Well, and to me, that's such a brilliant critique, because I think it also speaks to just how successful the anti-Brown movement has been.
Mm-hmm.
I just interviewed a gentleman about the Southern Manifesto and how, the South really organized to stop Brown by any means necessary. And I think we've seen some of the successes, creep all over the place. And I think that's, we at least have Plessy is so brilliant.
Yeah. Oh, and I do, like, I know you mentioned this, like, we see these things in the North. My experience growing up is in Ohio. I have worked in northern states. I currently now work in Massachusetts. And so thinking of the history of integration in Boston, oh my goodness, so this is not just, while we look to the South for all of the things that went wrong, they happened in the North. And in some ways they were more insidious, because, as the desegregation plan started rolling back, those were cases in Michigan. So all over the country, we see these challenges happening.
Right. And when you look at the map and the school distributions, you really do see just how segregated we are as a culture and education system. But I'd like to end with maybe a hopeful note about how we can change it. And you kind of allude to it but you don't allude to it. You say it just explicitly, that people need to work together. And maybe you could tell us how you envision.
Absolutely. One of the things that I am a proponent of is that, one, we shouldn't view education in isolation. And so we have to have conversations with the people in our neighborhoods. So we need to know our neighbors. We need to consider, and the conversation around schooling and what happens in schools is not just for folks who have children. For folks who don't have children, or folks whose children who are empty nesters, what happens in our school impacts all of us, because just that kind of sappy, the children are our future. It is the next generation. And so what is happening in PK-12 schools impacts us all. So grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, children themselves, we absolutely do need to come together and work together. And certainly, one can inquire about, what are grassroots organizations in your local community? Because there are people who do this work around bringing people together around education, and the ability to cross bridges, because there's thriving homeschool communities. Like, their parents, they've got children. Should they not talk to parents who've got children in public schools or private schools or parochial schools? Like, there's ways to have common ground. And I'm supposed to end on a positive note. We've got to look past that individualistic ideals that we've been socialized into and see the education of all children, no matter what vehicle how it takes place, as a community endeavor. And I think that's the hard thing, is coming together and see this as collective action, versus my child's got a voucher, we're leaving. But the education of the children who are left behind matters for you and your child too.
And I think too, that there's a time limit on it too, where if you have a kid in pre through, kindergarten through K, you only have 8 years, and you can't fix much in 8 years. But once that child's out of the schools, you have to continue to be, as you were saying, there's empty nesters are almost more important because they're the ones who have to take care of the kids who are in there now.
Correct. Be those who are in a position to own property, be invested in what's happening with your property taxes and how they're being utilized. But just show up, because schools should be viewed as community resources, as places to bring community together.
Well, thank you for this. And I think we have a little bit better understanding of vouchers and charters and how it all came to be. So are you working on something now that we can look forward to?
Well, as I sort of shared, around that topic, my understanding has changed, well, enhanced. I won't say it's just changed completely, but so has my focus on sort of what I'm reading and writing about, and sort of what's on topic and what's on trend now is, we know that children of European ancestry, that their numbers are dwindling, but there's opportunity here as the PK-12 population diversifies. And how do we have teachers that represent that? So one, making sure that white educators are culturally competent to support all children. And we're not just talking about race and ethnicity, but, students with disabilities, students whose first language is not English. So that, but then also, how do we raise up a cohort of racially and ethnically diverse educators to support all children? And research is clear about the benefits for especially elementary children, having a teacher that looks like them, the trajectory, i.e. high school completion, interest in college, what that means for the child, but for our society, and having an educated workforce. So there are benefits to having a diverse teacher pipeline and pool.